Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Kinda Murdery, a true crime podcast that's mostly about murder, and always about the strange and compelling stories that arise when the path less traveled twists to darkness, and those who walk its shadows surrender to violence and corruption. I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. We have a perilous journey ahead, so thank you for lending me your courage and good company. Welcome to part 2 of the case of the severed feet. Notice I said part 2, so if you haven't heard part 1 yet, go back and listen to it. Then rejoin us. We'll save you a spot. Now, on Thursday, I told you that this mystery began in 2007, and the modern version of it did. But the first known incident of a severed foot in footwear washing up on the beach near Vancouver occurred 120 years earlier. This was an incident that ended up commemorated with its own place name. In 1887, police found a severed leg in a knee-high boot in the woods of False Creek, a narrow inlet which these days separates downtown Vancouver from the West End. It was surmised that the leg had belonged to a man who had gone missing some days before, and that it was all that remained of him after an encounter with a local cougar. No, I don't mean an attractive older woman, but rather a mountain lion, or puma. The local trees that were there where the boot was found have gone, but the area where the police found the famous footwear with the severed foot over a century ago, that area is now officially known as Leg in Boot Square. So just what in tarnation is going on here? Are we dealing with undead cannibals? An ancient vampire who has a thing for sensible footwear and ultra-violence? Is this phenomenon of the severed feet the work of immortal Canadian cultists who extend their lives by dismembering joggers? How and why in the world were there severed feet washing up on Canada's western shores 120 years ago and today? Maybe it was a cougar attack in 1887, and maybe something much more sinister is happening now. It's time we found out. So, if you're ready, I suggest that you put your personal items underneath the seat in front of you, stow your carry-on in the overhead compartment, let go of the cares of the day, but make sure your seatbelt is fastened. There's turbulence expected ahead. Kinda Murdery, the case of the severed feet, part 2, starts now. Before we really get going, it's important that I give credit where credit is due. Much of this episode is taken from the excellent March 2021 article in National Geographic written by Erica Engelhaupt. There's a source in the show notes if you'd like to read it. And in fact, the article is an excerpt from Erica's excellent book which covers this case, entitled Gory Details, Adventures from the Dark Side of Science, which is right up Kinda Murdery's alley, and I think it'll be right up yours too. So if you've enjoyed the last episode and this one, go out and support the author who made it possible. Buy Erica's book. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. And with that, let's go. 3 elements were key to finding the solution to the grisly mystery of the severed feet. And they were, number 1, a better understanding of body decomposition in the sea. Number 2, an appreciation of changes in the footwear industry. And number 3, DNA research. Let's start with what happens when a dead body ends up in the ocean. Bodies don't just decompose when they sink. They're picked apart by scavenging creatures of the deep. Those bottom feeders prefer parts of the body with softer tissues around the orifices, but also including the ankles. Research from 2007 by Simon Fraser University for the Canadian Police on body decomposition, conducted in the very waters where many of the feet would be found, showed that deep-dwelling fish, shrimp, and crustaceans could reduce a corpse to a skeleton in under 4 days. While what remains of the body stays put on the sea floor, the gnawed-off feet float to the surface, at least if they're buoyed by recent generation sneakers. That's because shoes made after the year 2000 tend to be made of lighter foam than their pre-2000 counterparts, and also they often have soles that contain air pockets. Yeah, I think we're all familiar with Nike Air and all the knockoff brands. Additionally, the area's topography and prevailing westerly winds help bear flotsam and jetsam ashore through the Salish Sea. Though the discovery rate slowed down after the beginning of the severed foot mystery, the mystery endured, but scientists were formulating their own theories far less spectacular than those in the media. By the time the matching pair showed up in February of 2016, they were pretty sure. As mentioned before, the latest sneakered foot turned up in 2019, and given footwear trends, it's unlikely to be the last. However, as I mentioned at the start, as far back as 1887, the phenomenon of severed feet was known locally. That's long before modern sneaker technology made its occurrence more likely. So, what's going on with the modern mystery? And if sneakers don't explain it all, how were the old-timey severed feet showing up? To begin with, we must understand what happens to a dead body once it's in the water. So let's follow the adventures of a seafaring cadaver. Once in the water, a cadaver's first move will be to either float or to sink. This is a surprisingly crucial step as it will help to determine what happens next. A floating object will be carried with the winds and by surface currents and might soon wash ashore. A sinker, on the other hand, might remain in place or be tugged in a different direction by deeper currents. What's more, a floating body exposed to air will decompose differently from one that sinks, with ramifications for the fate of its feet. One might assume that a drowned person will sink because their lungs are full of water, and that a cadaver's air-filled lungs would otherwise act as a flotation device. But the reality is not so simple. Using data collected in 1942, E.R. Donahue of the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology set out to settle the matter in a 1977 article titled, "Human Buoyancy, a Study of 98 Men." The 98 men in question were healthy U.S. Navy men in the 20 to 40 year age group. Each was suspended underwater and weighed, both with his lungs full of air, and after expelling as much air as possible. It's no easy task to wait to be weighed underwater with no air in your lungs. But again, these were Navy men. With their lungs fully inflated with air, all the men floated. But once they had emptied their lungs, as would be the case with a dead body, most of the men sank in fresh water. Only 7% floated. In seawater, though, people are more buoyant. 69% of the Navy men would float if they were dead and naked in the ocean, God forbid, Donahue estimated. But it was a close call. Just a little added weight, such as heavy clothing or water in the lungs, would cause a body to sink. In the end, the data suggests, cadavers are overall more likely to sink than to float, and people who drown are the most likely to sink. What's more, once a body sinks, it tends to go straight to the bottom. Sometimes an underwater cadaver will eventually bloat, just like a body on land, causing it to bob to the surface. But that doesn't always happen. In a deep lake or ocean, it may never come back up. Not only does the cold inhibit decay in deep waters, but the greater water pressure there also prevents any gases from expanding and causing bodies to float. Instead, other microbial processes take over and convert a sunken body's tissue to that waxy soap-like substance I mentioned in episode 1 of this story, adipocere. Adipocere can persist for years, even centuries in a low-oxygen environment. And that's exactly what investigators saw on the feet they examined in the Salish Sea. They were covered in adipocere, suggesting that the cadavers sank and remained underwater as they decomposed. That could explain where the remainders of the body were. They sank, and they stayed sunken. But why didn't the feet stay down with the bodies? To understand how the feet set sail sans bodies, we need to understand how a human body might decompose underwater and whether its feet are prone to pop off and float away. Scientists study the process of human cadaver decomposition at several U.S. forensic research sites, but these are all on land. None had ventured to drop a body in the ocean, but the investigation was not dead in the water. In the summer of 2007, forensic scientist Gail Anderson of Simon Fraser University was conducting a study for the Canadian Police Research Centre to understand how quickly a homicide victim would decompose in the ocean. Because ethics rules preclude using a human body, you don't say, she used a dead pig instead. Pigs have often been used in forensic research as a stand-in for a human body. They are roughly comparable in size and quite similar in biology. Of course, I know there are those that feel there are ethics problems with using a pig body as well. Just keep in mind that this is not my investigation, it's purely a story that I'm telling. So Gail Anderson contrived to drop pig bodies into the ocean. Even better, she conducted her study in the Salish Sea, not far from where the third foot would be found 6 months later. Her team dropped the dead pig into the water, and it promptly sank 308 feet to the sea floor. What happened next was not pretty. The pig carcass was quickly eaten by a large and unruly mob of shrimp, lobsters, and Dungeness crabs, starting with the expected areas, the anus region and facial orifices. It was, Anderson reported, as if a Red Lobster buffet had risen up to exact its revenge. Since then, Anderson has dropped more pigs even deeper in the Strait of Georgia, a main channel of the Salish Sea, and found that in some cases scavengers can skeletonize a carcass in less than 4 days. So what about the feet? Well, it turns out that underwater scavengers like crustaceans will work around bones and other tough obstacles, preferring to pick apart softer tissues. And unlike bony ball and socket joints that join our legs to our hips, our ankles are made up mostly of soft stuff, ligaments, and other connective tissue. So it follows that a sunken shoe-wearing cadaver in the Salish Sea is likely to be chewed apart by scavengers and have its feet disarticulated from the rest of the body in short order. Scientific forensic investigators cautioned that they should not be referred to as severed feet because severed means that someone cut them off, and no coroner ever found any cut marks on a bone to suggest that. What's more, feet wearing sneakers made in the last decade would almost certainly float. Not only have gas-filled pockets been made common, as I mentioned previously, yes, we're all familiar with Nike Airs and Reebok pumps and the whatnot. Also, shoes made after the year 2000 began to use foams in the sneaker soles that were noticeably lighter with more air mixed in. In other words, the shoes became a lot more buoyant. So now we have a seafaring foot, sneaker-clad and ready to sail. But why the Salish Sea? If feet are likely to float away from dead bodies, why aren't beaches everywhere littered with them? I find it interesting and a little bit unsettling here that there seems to be a basic assumption that people are just dying willy-nilly daily at sea and then being violently dismembered by lobsters and crabs, and that there would in fact be individual sneaker-clad feet covering every beach in the world like sand, except there is something special and particularly murdery about the Salish Sea, so let's find out what that is. It certainly seems a strange, if not morbid, assumption to make. Possibly the man who knows the most about how and where things end up in the Salish Sea is Parker McCready, a professor of oceanography at the University of Washington in Seattle. He's built a three-dimensional computer simulation of the coastal ocean of the Pacific Northwest, including the Salish Sea. It's all realistic, he says, in the sense that it has realistic tides, winds, rivers, and ocean conditions. The simulation is called Live Ocean. Brightly colored water sloshes around the map according to the day's weather and tides. And through strength in numbers, tiny sea creatures, plankton, help to create big ocean currents. And, teensy as they are, they may have a not-so-small effect on the ocean. While it's believed that wind and tidal currents are the primary causes of the mixing of ocean waters, scientists at Stanford University have discovered that zooplankton can also have this effect. And so plankton movement too is factored into McCready's model. He uses the model to predict where an oil spill would travel over the course of 3 days. The simulation shows black blobs appear near Seattle and Tacoma, simulating the hypothetical oil spill, and immediately start flowing north into Puget Sound, sailing on rainbow-colored swirls that depict moving waters of various salinities. That's salt levels. Soon the blobs break apart into thin streamers and dots, splitting and sloshing in every direction as tides and currents push them around. As it turns out, live ocean reveals an important key to the mystery why so many feet are washing up here in the Salish Sea in particular, and the answer is the Salish Sea has a perfect storm of feet ensnaring properties. The reasons add up. First, it's an unusually large and complex body of inland water which acts as a trap. As McCrady's model shows, once something goes in the water, it might wash ashore in plenty of places, but it's still within the Salish Sea. Second, the prevailing winds are westerlies, so they bring stuff in from the ocean and rather than pushing it out to sea. And finally, there's something McCrady's model doesn't show, but he points it out. You see lots of folks wearing sneakers at the beach in the Pacific Northwest, where many choose to hike among slippery rocks. Taken together, all these factors, plus the cold, deep waters and healthy scavenger population, make the Salish Sea the ideal foot magnet. Now hold on. Earlier I thought perhaps that it was stated that these feet could have come from almost anywhere and almost any time, and that several of them were known not to be Canadian, but here we're now saying that, hey, people around here wear sneakers at the beach all the time, which implies that the unidentified bodies ought to be local. Again, perhaps the authorities mistook an explanation of the natural phenomenon for a solution to possible crimes. But I'm not an expert, so don't listen to me. What I would like to know is who were the owners of the Salish Sea feet? Well, the first place investigators looked was missing person reports. The Coroner's Service has now compared DNA from each foot to a database of more than 500 missing people in British Columbia. Plus, Canada's new National Missing Persons DNA program launched in 2018. Using DNA, the team linked 9 of the feet to 7 missing people. For 2, both feet were found. Most had been missing for a year or more. The longest missing person had disappeared in 1985. His foot found in a hiking boot in 2011. The most recent case, the foot of a young man who disappeared in 2016, was documented to have washed up on an island in Puget Sound in 2019. Alright, so it sounds like it was a lot of Canadians. The Coroner's Service in British Columbia reports that none of the Canadian cases so far have been found to result from homicide. In some cases, it was clear that a person had died by accident or by taking their own life, as in the case of the tragic young woman who jumped from the bridge in her New Balances. Other times, circumstances are hazier. In the case of a young man whose foot was found in Puget Sound in 2019, U.S. police said they couldn't rule out either homicide or suicide, and, for those who vanished without witnesses, it's nearly impossible to glean a cause of death from a foot in a sneaker alone. By the time the excerpt from Erica Inglehop's book was published as an article in National Geographic, 5 of the feet in British Columbia remained unidentified. Inglehop has this to say about why the shores of the Salish Sea have been littered with human feet since 2007. She writes the following: "Some, no doubt, will be disappointed to learn that a serial killer wasn't stalking the rocky shores of the Pacific Northwest. Although the mystery of the floating feet would make a great title, it probably won't become a Netflix original documentary, especially once producers discover that their footage would mostly feature crabs dragging pig entrails across the ocean floor, rather than lingering shots of a serial killer's high school yearbook photo. That's the difference between armchair CSI fans and actual forensic scientists. A scientist wants to know the right answer, even if it's mundane. But if you think about it, it's actually pretty exciting that nature hands us clues to what might otherwise remain cold cases. Even years later, a missing person might be found, his or her death investigated, all because of a peculiar combination of foot physiology, scavenger behavior, and evolving footwear technology. Sometimes, such unexpected clues lead us to places we never thought we'd go, if only we're willing, patient, and brave enough to follow them. And sometimes, they do it wearing sneakers. The slight derision she expresses toward armchair CSI fans, of which I'm one and I'm sure many true crime fans are, other than that, she makes a pretty great point here, that while scientific explanation may be less dramatically exciting, less dramatically satisfying, it is pretty cool that the natural scientific explanation is making us aware of deaths that we wouldn't otherwise know about and offering the opportunity to investigate them. So I hope you're not too disappointed by the solution to the case of the severed feet. And I have something further to add. I actually take issue with the term solution. I do, in fact, object to the general description, which you can find just about anywhere on the internet, that the severed foot mystery has been explained and or solved. All that's actually been explained is why the feet keep showing up on the shores of the Salish Sea. But these are still dead people. There are still 5 feet that have not been identified. And authorities in Inglehop think that feet will continue to arrive. So I say it again, these are still dead people, human beings, and with the exception of the few that tragically took their own lives, we still, for the most part, don't know the identities of the rest of them. And we don't know how or why all of those victims, even the ones who were identified, were killed, or at least died. I, for one, don't buy the theory that they just innocently fell off boats. As far as I'm concerned, all the other options, the mafia, tragically drowned illegal immigrants, tsunami victims, plane crashes, serial killers, and aliens, both abductions and autopsies, are still all on the table. And the "we figured it out, it's just science, stop asking questions" attitude coming from the authorities is a little suspect, to say the least. Kinda Murdery's next episode comes out on Thursday the 24th. Remember to call 988 if you ever need it. Never forget the world is a better place with you in it. Reach out to me if you'd like to connect with someone, kindamurdery@gmail.com. Share your stories of personal struggle so we can all learn to be more compassionate. And come on back here on Thanksgiving Day for another true crime story. I'm thankful for you. Believe it. I'm also Zevin Odelberg. And this has been Kinda Murdery.